Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Scotland webinar. Today, I'm sure that both our speakers will be very familiar to you. We have Chris Keane, who is our President-elect, and Chris is going to talk about her theme of broadening access to occupational hygiene for hard-to-reach groups. Chris is a chartered occupational hygienist with 35 years of experience in assessing hazardous substances, exposure risk and risk control strategies. She's worked across a broad range of industries from the major hazards sector to manufacturing, construction and agriculture. And she's a technical lead for occupational hygiene at HSE's Science and Research Centre in Buxton. Chris has also been a BOHS board member for 2 years and is currently our President-elect for today. And then following Chris, we have our CEO, Professor Kevin Bampton, who's going to review the latest legal issues for us in occupational hygiene and asbestos, with a focus on developments in Scotland. Kevin is the Chief Executive of the BOHS Society and Chair of the British Standards Institutes. Sorry, someone's not on mute. Thank you. And he's a visiting Professor of Law at the University of Gloucestershire Business School and formerly Professor of Public Law, Foreign Office and United Nations Advisor. He's been actively engaged in construction, technology and environmental issues and is a member of the Health in Construction Leadership Group. So with that, I will hand over to Chris, who's going to do our first presentation, and we will have a question and answer session after each of the speakers. And if I could just remind you to keep your microphones on silent, and if you've got any questions afterwards, we can do them either as a hands up or if you want to pop something in the chat box and we can read them out. Okay, thanks very much. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thanks to everyone for attending this webinar this afternoon. It's a bit of a shame we couldn't get up to Scotland and present the thing in the flesh, but the upside of that is that we get such good high attendance at these webinars that we didn't traditionally achieve at face-to-face physical meetings. So thank you all for tuning in, and I've seen people joining from all around the UK and even overseas. So I appreciate that. So I'm going to give about a 30-minute talk on my presidential theme, the thing that I'm going to try to shine a light on during my year as BOHS president. I make some small apologies to people because as these webinars are not really regional events anymore, I'm conscious that there probably may be people on the call who've been to a previous one of my webinars. I think I've delivered this 4 times online now. My presentation hasn't changed dramatically over that time. It has evolved as my thinking's evolved on this subject. But if you've tuned into one of the earlier sort of President-elect webinars, you will see a fair amount of repetition, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Okay. So what I need to do now is share my screen. Just bear with me. So I'm going to assume everyone can see my screen unless someone starts shouting and stops me. So I'm going to assume you can all see that.
Yeah, you're all good there, Chris.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you very much. So yes, when you become President-elect of BOHS with a view to becoming president, you get to have a theme, you get to have a topic, a subject, something that you want the society to put a bit of attention and focus on for your year as president. And this is my theme. It's broadening out the reach of occupational hygiene. You'll probably be aware, hopefully you'll be aware that the current president, Alison Margery, has had very strong theme looking at collaboration. We have got, as an organisation, we have got dozens, if not hundreds, of different collaborations, different partnerships going with industry bodies and with regulators and with other health and safety groups nationally and around the world. And Alison has done a really good job in, first of all, pulling together all the information on all of these different collaborations so we can see the totality of our partnerships. But then that's allowed us to focus in on the partnerships and the collaborations where we think there's going to be the most benefit. We're going to get the most bang for our buck. And what it really has done, the work that Alison's on collaboration, is taken us into new areas and new industry sectors where previously occupational hygiene had a very low profile. Most notably, I think, fairly obviously to most, unless you've been in a cave for the last 2 years, you know, it's taken us into healthcare. It's largely as a result of the COVID pandemic, and we now have a presence and a profile in that industry sector from which to grow and build. So my theme is building on what Alison's done on collaboration, but it's about taking us into different areas, different industry sectors, different places where we currently are pretty much unknown, or where we've got quite a low profile as a profession. Although you get the choice when you become president-elect to choose a theme, you can't go off, you know, wandering off in totally your own direction. It has to tie into the general BOHS strategy, the general BOHS aims and mission. Obviously it does. Hopefully, as members, you will be aware that we launched a new strategy last year, a 5-year strategy. There were a series of national webinars, I think, that were run last springtime to launch the new BOHS strategy. And again, hopefully, as members, you will all have had time to at least have a glance through it and be roughly familiar with the contents of that strategy. I'm not going to read out the aims to you all because I've put them up on the slide. What I will say is that in terms of my president's theme, I'm kind of tying it to the final bullet point that's on that slide. So that, but I will read this one out. This says that we're going to work, BOHS are going to work to ensure that all people in all working environments have the right protection at the right time. Okay, so that is a big ask. That is a huge mission when you think about the diversity of the world of work. And you've got people working in all kinds of different locations, working in offshore oil rigs, working in construction, working in the healthcare sector. That is a very, very broad area for us to be aiming to cover. The strategy in general is a very ambitious thing, and I'm sure you recognise that. To achieve the aims of the strategy, we're going to need to think differently. I think we're going to need to think differently because we're trying to take occupational hygiene here into places where we've never been before. As a society, BOHS have been around almost 70 years next year, I think. And we've done a lot of good over that time. But what we're trying to do with the new strategy is to take ourselves into different places. Maybe even to start to think a little bit more about what it means to be an occupational hygienist. As I said, these are very ambitious aims. And if we're going to achieve these aims, then I'm not saying that all hygienists think like this, because I know that they don't, but we need to recognise ourselves as being more than air sampling technicians, more than people who can evaluate LED systems. We need to think ourselves as influencers and try to work at a strategic level within industry and within government where we can to influence policy on a national level. So coming back a little bit closer to my presidential theme, and I've just pulled out another couple of lines from the current BOHS strategy. I think these two elements of the strategy really chime with my theme of broadening out the reach of occupational hygiene. If we're going to have an impact, we need to let people know who we are and what we do. And for quite a long time, when I first joined BOHS, sort of 30 years ago almost, I thought we were a little bit too inward looking. I mean, that has changed dramatically. In the last 15 years, that has changed dramatically. But we need to continue that journey, looking outwards and communicating with different audiences. And in order to communicate effectively with these different audiences, we're going to need to tweak our messages. We can't deliver the same message to different audiences. We need to understand their language. We need to understand the people that we're speaking to, and we need to tailor our messages to suit the audience. But the basic message right at the bottom of it all is always the same, and that is that workplace exposures should not be a cause of harm at an individual or at a societal level, and that prevention is always better than cure. I don't think I really need these graphs to convince this audience, because I'm speaking to occupational hygienists, but I couldn't help but slip a couple of graphs in anyway from HSE's own statistics. There is still a long way for us to go on occupational health in Great Britain in the 21st century. The graph on the left-hand side there, I don't know if you can see, but that is the rate of work-related ill health per 100,000 workers over the last 20 years. Don't get too hung up on the numbers up the vertical axes, but it's a flat line. Work-related ill health is not declining and has not been declining for the last 20 years. There was a slight upturn, if anything, in the last year in these stats, probably due to COVID, and it'll probably flatten out again as we come back to some sense of normality. But that is a flat line. There is no downward trend. And if you look at the safety stats, you know, workplace fatalities and the like, you will see downward trends in the safety stats, no matter how you slice them. So health is still, we have got a long way to go. The graph on the right hand side, I find even more worrying because that is occupational asthma. This is not self-related. This is data from the SWORD reporting scheme that's run by University of Manchester. It's a reporting scheme for occupational physicians to report in occupational disease. Occupational asthma has been on the increase for the last 5 years consistently, with maybe a slight dip in 2018, 2019, but a consistent increase in the prevalence of occupational asthma over the last 5 years. That is not a good news story. Occupational asthma is relatively easy to track in terms of respiratory disease. It's fairly short latency, and it's a little bit easier than some other diseases to tie the case of ill health back to a workplace exposure. So occupational asthma is probably toward the easier end of the spectrum of respiratory diseases to actually track. So it's worrying to see an upward trend. And I think we could reasonably assume that we might be seeing a similar trend in some of the longer latency diseases, COPD and silicosis, in addition to that. But say that they're harder to track, and it'll be a long time before that comes through in the figures. I think we all recognise that the world of employment has changed dramatically in the last few decades in Great Britain and across the world. We now have far fewer people who are permanently employed by large employers, people who've got a job for life, people who work for large manufacturers. The shape of our industry has changed, and the way that people are employed and put to work in these industries has changed. There's some stats up on the slide here. We now have close to 1 million agency workers in Great Britain. That's a very high proportion of our total workforce. 3/4 of our workforce are not in trade unions. They've got no TU representation at all in their workplace. And 6 million SMEs, of which 5.7 million are micro businesses. So it's a really disparate and diverse workforce that we've got in Great Britain in the 21st century. And some of these people, as I'm hopefully going to illustrate, are very, very difficult for us to reach as occupational health and safety professionals, occupational hygienists. You'll all be familiar with these terms. I've just stuck a few terms up on this slide. They all mean slightly different things. They probably mean different things to different people, but they've all become more and more commonplace terms that we see all over the place in the last 10 years or more. Okay. The one thing that all of these groups of workers have in common, in my opinion, is that they represent groups of people who are vulnerable to reduced standards of health protection in the workplace. For the people on the call that work as consultants out there, jobbing hygienists, I suspect that you've probably come across some of these groups at some time, you know, when you've been working at some of your clients' sites. Yeah. And I dare say that you've even probably had the opportunity to do a little bit of good to help people who are employed in some of these groups at some point, and that's fantastic. What I'm trying to do here is shine more of a light on these groups of people, to bring them closer to the edge of our radar as occupational hygienists, and to raise the profile. As I say, these people who are working, people who are employed in these groups are becoming more and more sort of prevalent and are making more and more sort of media attention as time goes by. This is something I pulled off the Guardian website, I think a couple of weeks ago. Gig working has more than doubled in England and Wales in the last 5 years. I apologise for not having a Scotland specific statistic there. I should have maybe thought about my audience before I pulled that slide in. But I suspect,
Chris, it's okay.
I suspect you've got a similar pattern happening north of the border too, yeah? And this, and the more I've looked into this, the more I find that there's been loads of research done. This is something from the Resolution Foundation, so a very respected and reputable organisation. This is 5 years old, well, 4 years old now, December 2017. This research, but I suspect it's still, the messages are still the same. 4 times as many UK firms have increased their use of agency workers, or had, in the 5 years prior to this research being conducted. So it's a massively growing area, increasing numbers of workers, hundreds of thousands of workers who are employed as agency staff, as casual staff in the gig economy, call it what you will. Just to focus in now, excuse me, just to focus in a little bit on 1 or 2 more specific things. So I've picked on 2 or 3 industries where I've got a particular interest, or I've got at least some sort of background knowledge. So the first is the cleaning industry, and I've got colleagues here in HSE Science Division who've done quite a lot of research around occupational asthma in the cleaning industry in the last few years. So I dig around on the internet, a little bit of research. I find a report from this organisation, the Focus on Labour Exploitation, which tells me that there are 342,000 people employed in the cleaning industry in Great Britain. That is a huge number of people, and that 86% of individuals working in this industry report work-related health issues. 86% of 300,000 workers is an awful lot of ill health. The main conditions that affect people working in this industry are occupational asthma, and I think cleaning products are the 3rd most common cause. Going back to the HSE stats, cleaning products are the 3rd most common cause of occupational asthma in Britain at the moment. Dermatitis, there's a lot of skin contact with chemicals, there's a lot of wet working goes on in the cleaning industry, and manual handling and musculoskeletal conditions, very prevalent in this industry. And a rhetorical question at the bottom of the slide: how often do we as a profession interact with anyone working in the cleaning sector? My experience is that it's not a commonly occurring thing. Agriculture is another area where I've got a little tiny bit of personal experience. So I've done little bits of research for HSE in the ag sector, looking at exposure to organic dusts. Again, you've got a very high prevalence of occupational disease in this sector. You have got massive underreporting of that occupational disease. The shape of the sector and the sort of the makeup of the employers in this sector, these are the vast majority of farms are micro businesses, family-owned concerns. They'll be very reluctant to report occupational disease. It'll probably go unnoticed. They'll just carry on working with these sort of developing respiratory conditions because that's their livelihood. They've not got access to formal health surveillance, so they'll often go undiagnosed for many years until they become too sort of ill to work any longer. Extrinsic allergic alveolitis, which doesn't trip off the tongue, is fairly common place in this industry, and HSE recognise the huge underreporting of extrinsic allergic alveolitis amongst farmers. I've pulled another quote from HSE website this morning. An incidence of occupational asthma in this population is several times the national average. I was reading something yesterday on an elevated incidence of COPD in this sector. That was attributing it to exposure to pesticides. Maybe that's not the only thing that's causing a lot of this disease. I think organic dusts, dust from feed, dust from animal products are all contributing to this burden of occupational disease, respiratory disease in agriculture. And again, a rhetorical question: how often do we as occupational hygienists get to do any work in the agriculture sector? You know, I believe it's pretty rare that we do that. This is a real life example from some site work that I was doing about 10 years ago, and I won't tell you what industry this was in, but we went on site and It was a large industrial facility, and it was a dirty process. This was never going to be a pristine, clean factory. The nature of what they were doing was such that it was always going to be a fairly dirty process. And the control at source in this particular workplace could and should have been better than it was. And I would hope that 10 years down the line, it is somewhat better than it was that when we saw it back then. But the whole facility was cleaned overnight, every night. There was so much debris and contamination getting out from the process and contaminating the workplace. They just couldn't possibly have continued to work unless it had been cleaned very, very regularly. And it wasn't a 24-hour production operation. There was only a day shift on. And I asked the health and safety manager how the facility was cleaned. And he informed me that every night they had agency staff come in and clean the place up. I asked the guy how this was done, and he had no real inkling as to what went on at night. All he knew is that the agency people came in and cleaned the workplace, and in the morning it was good to go. The production shift could come back on and resume production. So there was no oversight of the cleaning in this workplace at all. And this was a large, reputable employer. It was a total blind spot for them. They had no idea what went on their own premises with these cleaning staff, these agency staff on the night shift. We went back on the night shift to have a look at this. This was too interesting for us to not follow up on. And the standards of sort of health risk management were left a lot to be desired. You'd got young, largely untrained, unsupervised agency staff let loose with high pressure compressed air lancers, and basically they just blew the whole plant clean, blew all the debris off the high surfaces, off the shelves, off the ledgers, off the mezzanine floors, into a great big pile in the middle of the workroom, and blew that into the corner and swept it up and shoveled it up and threw it away into skips. It wasn't good what we saw. So I think the point I'm making is, even in a large sort of reputable organisation, these things are going on and they are off the radar, they're off the scale, because they're not happening on the production shift, they're not happening, on the day shift. They're often overlooked. So it's not all doom and gloom, and I don't want to sort of focus on it being such a negative picture, because we've done a lot in the last 10 years. BOHS have done some phenomenal work to reach out to some of these groups into some of these industries. The standout one for me was the Breathe Freely campaign, particularly the Breathe Freely in Construction campaign. So we kicked that off probably 7 years ago now, I think April 2015. There was a recognition back then that there was a huge burden of respiratory disease in the construction industry. There was a recognition within BOHS that there was very little interaction between the occupational hygiene profession and the construction sector. So this genius mastermind campaign was born, and it was, it was developed by a lot of really smart people that were around back then, led by Mike Slater. But there were plenty of people involved in the initial Breathe Freely construction campaign, and I've seen some of them join this call this afternoon. But what that achieved was phenomenal. It gave us a profile in a huge industry that so badly needed occupational hygiene to help it out of the problems that it had got. When we started Breathe Freely, occupational hygiene was virtually unrecognised as a term in construction. And now, certainly among the higher tier contractors and clients in the construction industry, they know very well what occupational hygiene is all about. Many of them employ full-time hygienists. Many of them use consultants to support their health and safety. And you hear senior leaders in the construction industry now singing the praises of our profession and recognising the vital role that hygienists play in controlling health risks in their industry. The picture on the right hand side there, I don't know if people have seen that. I don't think this has been particularly widely communicated, but it's been out 2 or 3 years now. That this is a guide that we produced in partnership with the TUC. It's a guide for union health and safety representatives. Again, that allows occupational hygiene to penetrate into industries and into areas where we've possibly had a low profile in the past. And I will mention, well, I've mentioned already, but I can't give a presentation these days without mentioning COVID and the pandemic. And a lot of the guidance that we've produced over the last 2 years, excellent technical guidance that we've produced over the last 2 years, has been aimed at the healthcare sector, which I've already said at the beginning of this call. You know, we had no profile, no presence in healthcare, or virtually none 2.5 years ago. This is just an extract from the excellent ventilation assessment tool that's on the website, but there's tons of other stuff on there as well. Again, getting us into industries where we previously were unknown and unrecognised. Just last year, this is another example of what we have achieved so far in this area. So there was a loophole in the PPE regs. It was a techie thing and a legal thing. I'll not go into the detail here, but basically employers were not under a legal obligation to provide free of charge PPE to everyone, to all workers. As I said, there were some sort of technical details around all this, but that was the bottom line. And there was a challenge by the Independent Workers Union of Great Britain that this loophole needed closing. HSE put out a call for a consultation exercise, and BOHS responded with a fairly strong contribution to that exercise. And as a result, this loophole has been closed and the PPE regs have been amended, so that employers now do have a legal duty to provide PPE free of charge to all workers that they've got influence over. So we have done a lot, we have achieved a lot, but what I'm trying to do is to take us a little bit further, out into these sort of uncharted waters where people don't know us, maybe to take us into the cleaning industry, maybe agriculture, maybe it's somewhere else. So the ideas are starting to form now. When I started to deliver these webinars last October, I really didn't have any firm ideas as to what we could do about this. I have now sort of, you know, I've had a lot of feedback from members through the webinars, and I have started to pull together some firmer and clearer ideas. And I had a good conversation with the executive committee, which is myself, Alison, Kelvin Williams and Kevin a couple of weeks ago, to start to pull together a plan. One thing that we definitely need is some insight. We don't understand these populations and these industries. We've had so little contact with them over the decades, that for us to start creating messages and delivering messages through a website would be the absolute wrong thing to do. We need to build some stakeholder relationships in these areas. We need to decide which industries we're going to try to influence, and we need to build networks. We need to develop our own insight. What messages do we need to deliver into these industries? We don't need to start hitting them with loads of clever technical guidance, you know, 35-page long documents as to how to design LEV systems and the like. So we need to tailor our messages to suit the audience, and we can only do that by actually interacting with the audience. And also we need to identify how we deliver these messages, what channels are effective. Sticking it up on our website is not going to get to any of these people at all. We need to understand how they receive information, how they learn, and we need to deliver our messages through the appropriate channels to get to these worker groups. I'm hoping that we can create a small sort of BOHS working group to work on this over the next year or so. Ordinarily in the past, I would have said if you're interested in getting involved, then get in touch. But you'll see on my next slide that there's a little bit more to it than that at the moment. But you know, I would just implore you all as practicing hygienists that when you're out there in the world, you know, practicing your profession and visiting workplaces, to not forget about these groups. Ask about the cleaners, ask about the agency workers, and you know, turn over a few stones and bang the drum on behalf of these groups of workers, because they so desperately need it. The final slide, which is kind of linked into my previous slide now, because I just wanted to give a quick call out about volunteering for BOHS. So the society needs volunteers. We are the lifeblood of BOHS. We achieve so much as a society. We punch above our weight in so many different areas, and that is largely down to, well, it's largely down to the quality of the head office staff, but to our sort of fleet of volunteers that go out and do unpaid work on behalf of BOHS. And, you know, I'm one of them. Everyone that sits on the board is one. Our examiners are volunteers, that people work on various committees. Yes, there is a time commitment to becoming a volunteer for BOHS. So, you know, it's not possible for everyone, all members, to volunteer. But it gives you so much back. It provides great opportunities to develop your competence and your capability, and to give you experience and exposure to situations that otherwise you wouldn't get to see in your normal sort of working life. So Shani Jackson at headquarters has done some great work in the last few months. She will be getting our volunteering onto a more sort of professional and formal footing. So if you keep an eye on the BOHS website, on the main website, there's going to be a web page going on there in the next few weeks, I think, which will describe all the volunteering roles, and hopefully there'll be some roles on there to join a working group to work on sort of my presidential theme. So watch this space, I think, and thanks to Shani for doing that. And please, if you think you've got some time and something to offer BOHS as a volunteer, then please do so. I think that's all I've got to say. I think we'll open it up for questions, if that's all right, Helen. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Chris. And lots of thought-provoking material in there. Just when you talk about the agricultural sector there in FAS, which is the partnership for health and safety groups in Scotland, we actually tried to target the young farmers, but we just didn't get any response. So I know how hard it is to try and get into that sector. So what I'm going to do, if I can hand over to David, who's going to manage the questions for this, if that's okay, David. He's still there?
Yep.
Perfect. Thanks, David.
We get any questions coming up?
I don't think there's any in the chat box. I don't know if people want to put their hands up, if they've got anything they want to ask Chris.
Well, if you anything you want to ask, or I mean, if you've got any ideas as to, you know, how we can get into some of these different places.
Chris, could I start while we're waiting for other folk? Up here, I works my full-time job with Socotech, and one of our big aims in the coming year is to try and approach as many different industries and basically do a promotion. We're very conscious sometimes, even taking things like Quarries and so on, which we do a lots of work for the big companies.
Yeah.
There are hundreds up here of small privately owned quarries, 2-3 employees. And we are going to try and do some promotion work as a company, inviting them in for a free lunch and a chat, basically, and just try and get the message over. And I think maybe a bit more of that from all consultancies would help.
Absolutely, David. You know, I couldn't agree more. I think an unfortunate element here for consultancies, because consultancies are obviously, you know, commercial businesses, is that many of these people work in companies that just can't afford, you know, even the most basic. But anything we can do to communicate positive messages to them, to raise their awareness, to signpost them in the right direction, has got to be a good thing.
I think I'll pick up one thought I did hear, and I was thinking out the box, and certainly not something we'll achieve in the next year or anything, but there was a thought that maybe we need almost a national occupational health service where everybody contributes a wee bit and becomes free at the point of use for small, medium-sized enterprises. Maybe that's an ambition we can work to over the next 5-10 years. But just get somebody that can help support small companies.
Yeah, I think that has been floated in other areas. It's a great thing to work towards, and you know, if I could see it within sort of my career, I think that would be a great step forward for everyone, especially the people at these.
Coming up there, but I seem to have lost who's.
I think Kieran's got a question there.
Yeah, it's me. I was just going to say, I'm an ex-farmer, and actually just at the weekend, I was with some of my farming friends, and they were actually bemoaning that the HSE had come on to them, looking at hay bales and sacking, and I kind of said, well, you know, you are in such a dangerous environment, and you have any idea, you know, hey, you know, I think that they focus on, you know, they didn't realise, and these are my farming friends who I've known for years, well, obviously they're still farming, they had no idea really of the potential for them to develop asthma from from the harvest. I mean, I know a lot of the combines have got filtration systems in, but they probably don't manage them very well. And they were unaware that it's almost as though the focus, and this is one of my kind of bugbears anyway, is the focus is always on the safety issues and not enough on the health issues. I think if you really want to get to the farmers, as we know, as you really said, Chris, they don't really think about anything until it's way too late. But I think changing the tack, instead of just going on about how they stack the bales, which yes, they obviously need to make sure they're not going to fall on anybody's head, but changing the tack to saying, well, if you're an arable farmer, how do you manage your filtration in the combine? How do you manage the health of your workers? Farmers will always have arables, will always have key staff, and they'll have contract staff. And it goes back to, how do you manage, how does your contractor manage his combine, the filtration systems in there? What about the guys working in the tractor next to them? The grain drying. Now, a lot I know the grain drying is obviously about drying in the silos, but there's so much dust generated from that, and the focus is always about drowning in silos rather than how to mitigate and control the dust. So I kind of highlight, and that shut my friends up momentarily, but I think again, when the HC go on site, they really need to start asking health-based questions, not just focusing on. I mean, I live on a farm, well, just next door to a farm, and they get the checks for the quad bikes, you get the checks for this. Nothing is related to health. It's all about safety, and so therefore there's an element of division, which is unfortunate, but I don't think they really understand why the HC are there and why they're trying to raise awareness of health. They are a tough bunch, but I think if you change the tack on them, they go, oh, okay, and then they'll think about it. But that's all I really going to think about the farming side, and because they are tricky characters and they are isolated and they forget and they don't think about anybody else, so they think about their own farm. Certainly with the young farmers, Helen, if you want to go back down there, I can speak to Rebecca down the road from me, because she's a young farmer person, about finding some way to raise awareness of alveolitis through working with moldy hay, working with all that stuff. Farmers. I think it'd be a good tack to take. But that's what I was going to say on the farming side of things, Chris.
Well, I think I've had a long chat this morning with a colleague here who is a senior researcher, but she is also a farmer. She lives on a farm, a micro business, and she kind of alluded to many of the same things that you just spoke about there, Kieran. We need to understand the culture in this industry. We need to understand what pushes their buttons, what will drive them to change. I can't comment on HSE's interventions policy in agriculture, because I'm here with my BOHS hat on, not HSE hat on, but an HSE cut their cloth according to their resources. But certainly as BOHS, we can focus on health. We don't get involved in the safety side. There are a lot of dangerous things on farms, from tractors to electricity to slurry. And if we can get them to focus on some of the health issues, accepting that not all of them are going to change their behaviour, but if we can just start to push them in the right direction, then we've done some good.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I just sort of thought that, I don't know if the HSE or BOHS could do that, but I mean, obviously I work for Scottish Power, and every year we have accidents from farmers and power lines, and obviously their fatalities are there. We go to all major shows. There's always a stand at all the major shows, and there's demonstration at all the major shows, and through the public safety division of Scottish Power, you can see that it's been really, really beneficial. It may well be that if we really want to target these kind of groups, that we need to do something that we've never done before and go to the Royal Show, go to Bilthwells, go to Stoneleigh, and really say hi to these people and get them to come to the stand, because that's all farmers will congregate at these major shows, guarantee that. And if you really want to get your message across, whether you do BOHS or another avenue, if you want to get there, you got to go to the trade shows. We do it for
I agree, Kieran. Whether we go to the trade shows or just something different, but something else you said there, whatever we do, we've got to do something we've never done before. We've been here for 70 years and these people have never heard of us. So we need to do something that we haven't done before. We don't need to keep doing more. As I say, creating some lovely technical guidance and putting it on the website is not the thing to do. Whatever it is we do to reach these people, it needs to be different, and it could well be having a presence at events like you've just mentioned there is one element of what we're able to do. But we've got to work within our resource envelope. You know,
Yeah.
these things cost money, then we may or may not be able to afford it. But no, thank you very much.
You go on the back of private companies such as Scottish Power. I have no idea. I put myself out there. I have no idea whether there's funding, but it could be that, you know, the BOHS work with other public or private companies that invest in similar areas. Anyway, I'm probably taking too much airtime, but just idea.
No, thank you very much. Thank you, Kieran.
Thank you.
I've got a couple of messages up here, one from Alec. The NFU and agricultural colleges are useful conduits for disseminating messages in occupational hygiene issue and risks. NFU may be open to short articles and suggestions for lectures, which I think is an excellent idea.
Thank you.
This Richard Topless suggested to get our message out more widely, we may need someone that understands Instagram, TikTok, FB has just dawned to me, Facebook, and can push our posts in the right direction. I think I'm the wrong generation for lots of that, but
Me too,
that's a good point.
unfortunately.
Use every possibility we can to get the message out.
Yeah.
Eric Ball asked, is there a plan for making use of the HI management tool as a way of engaging these subcontractors to keep them, to help them identify what they need to improve?
There is no specific plan, Eric, to use the high management standard, but I am acutely aware that the high management standard is a fantastic tool that was developed by some incredibly talented people and has somewhat been forgotten in the last 2 or 3 years. So I think we need to remember all the tools that we've already got in our toolkit, and the high management standard is a great thing. You know, I was really very impressed by it, and it's got applicability. I mean, it was developed for construction. It's not construction specific. It's applicable to all industries, and we need to sort of pull it out of the archives because it has slid away a little bit in the last 3 years. So thanks for reminding us about it, but I certainly hadn't forgotten about the high management standard.
Comment from Andrew Kennedy, health and safety. Thinking outside the box, what about asking the producers of the BBC's Countryfile for a feature on the show?
Well, if you don't ask, you don't get. I suppose Kevin's on the call, so we can take. We need to consider all of these different avenues. You know, however unlikely they may be, we need to consider. You know, all these avenues. So yeah, thank you. Thanks.
I think sort of flying the wall documentaries and so on are one way of getting known, and the big challenge for the BOHS and for our profession as a whole. I think it's improving over the years. Like used to be when you said you were an occupational hygienist, folk assumed you worked with teeth. And failing that, you cleaned kitchens and toilets. The message is slowly getting out there. But it's just a case, I think, of plugging away and use every avenue that's open to us.
Right. We just have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
There's got various other comments, but they're largely following the same theme of just getting reaching different groups.
I will get the chat. Lee will sort of summarise the chat and send it through afterwards. And I have picked up some very useful tips from the chats from previous webinars. So, you know, if you've got anything you want to add and you don't want to put your hand up and talk, then just stick a message on the chat, please. Thank you.
Anybody else want to put any messages up at the moment, or do we move on?
I think I've more or less taken my time, haven't I, David?
Right, I think at this stage I'll pass back to Helen if she's still there.
Yeah, I'm back, David. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Chris. So now I'd like to pass over to our next speaker, Kevin, and I'll let you give us your presentation. Thanks, Kevin.
And I'll just ask Chris whether I can borrow the screen back.
Are you able to help us out there, Lee? Have you got it? Excellent.
While get control of the screen, just a comment about this wonderful discussion that we've been having here. If you've got ideas to sort of reach out to other groups, if you sort of are, able to engage with people, etc., please don't sort of stand on ceremony. Drop us a line if you've got an idea, and head office is here to support you if you want to reach out or whatever. Because our reach comes from our members, etc. So I'm sort of delighted to have a little bit of time with you today. I'm sort of reverting to type in the sense that I'm talking about law, but law and occupational hygiene are a perfect combination. And I noticed there are people from all over the UK, and indeed from other jurisdictions. But I'm going to be unashamed. I'm going to be talking about a Scottish-focused approach. But Scotland exists within, obviously, the United Kingdom and within Europe, whether or not we want to accept that from a legal point of view. So it's a Scottish focus, but things that will affect Scotland. And I'm a bit of I'm a Scotland fan, and as you can see from my background, this is the view from my home up in Scotland. So I'm biased. So I do state that I have a real interest in Scotland and matters Scottish. And the Scottish legal system is a fantastic vehicle for justice. Many of you will know that the foundations of our ability to protect ourselves from bad practice, from negligence, etc., was founded in Scottish law. The English borrowed it, but the Scots created it. And I'm hoping that in occupational hygiene, this is going to be the trend for the future. And I see very exciting opportunities there. So hopefully you can see this. And when I say I hope Scotland will continue to lead, I think there are some really, really interesting initiatives that are already coming out of Scotland, and not necessarily out of the Scottish administration. Two pieces of putative legislation that have been brought forward in Scotland in the last year or so by members of the Scottish Parliament, really interesting. And so the first one, which is the Scottish Employment Injuries Advisory Council Bill, this it sounds a bit remote from occupational hygiene, but do bear with me. When Scotland was devolved from United Kingdom, had its own powers vested in it, it didn't copy all of the organs that England maintained for itself, and it didn't have a specialist in advisory capacity on things like industrial diseases. Mark Griffin, who's an MSP, proposed a bill, I think it was earlier in 2020, to bring about a specialist expert advisory body to look at, amongst other things, occupational diseases, and to get expert advice to guide the Scottish administration in terms of all aspects of social policy and social justice. Now, this was very much aimed towards when people are already ill, but BOHS provided a consultation feedback on this. We were very supportive, but we also pointed out there were ways in which Scotland could do things somewhat better than England, not least by ensuring that occupational hygiene was part of that advisory function. And our submission was very greatly well received. COVID got in the way. The bill was going to lapse. Mark's team got in touch, asked BOHS whether we would canvass all of the members of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee of the Scottish Parliament to resurrect the bill. We wrote to every single MSP, and I have to say they contacted us, many of them, to say they were going to support, and the bill is alive and kicking and moving forward. And it's great to know that by advocating as the BOHS by sort of giving our technical and expertise, we can influence things. The second bill, which has been withdrawn, does, if you like, pave the way to what might be happening in the future. One of the things that BOHS has been saying repeatedly, apart from around the notion of sustainable workplace health, is that we are spending a fortune on occupational illnesses, on benefits, on medical treatment, on lost taxation, and wasting a huge amount of talent. And at the moment, it's cheap for organisations to ignore long latency illnesses, to sort of not really worry about it, throw out some PPE to people, not think about designing out. It's cheaper and it's almost more tax effective. And what's interesting about this NHS charges bill was another MSP posited the view that, a bit like in environmental law, you have polluter pays, that employers who are cavalier about the way in which they look after their employees now, we should be going back to and saying, this is the cost of treating the people you didn't look after. It's quite an advanced idea, but it's one of those things that might not be in this form, but in some form, at some point, the cost of health, the cost to the general public of health by shortcutting health protection will probably end up at the doors of organisations. And we did some calculations in terms of the cost of occupational COPD. And if you could prevent occupational COPD, you could effectively raise as much money as the hike in national insurance is going to raise. You could prevent your way out of taxation. So these things are sort of swirling around, and they're going to be quite interesting. The Scottish Employment Industries Advisory Council bill, I think, will come to fruition. Something around the cost of industrial diseases and the relationship with employers is likely to circle around again. Chris very eloquently in her presentation outlined that as a result of judicial review by the Independent Workers Union of the UK government, the HSE was asked to reconsider or to consider how we could ensure that people who weren't employees but who were turning up at work could have all the same rights as employers. We had decided as a country that we were only going to give employment rights to employees. And as we know, and as Chris has identified, there are hundreds of thousands of workers who aren't quite employees. They're sort of 0-hour contracts, they turn up, etc., and aren't getting the same protection. So you could have two people working alongside, and the employee could have rights, and the non-employee might not have rights. And one of the impacts of that is that if it's cheaper to have someone who's a gig economy worker than an employee in terms of safety, there's a temptation that from a health and safety point of view, you just go for the gig economy worker. And so it's more than just about protecting gig economy workers, third limb workers. It's actually about maintaining the protections for employed people. And there've been a series of changes that were needed to act. So one is the PPE amendment regulations, which means that effectively any worker, whoever they're employed by, or even if they're self-employed, is entitled to free personal protective equipment. And it was really interesting looking on social media when this was promoted, people saying, does that mean we need to give our agency workers safety boots? And does that mean that people who are working for us need to be given PPE? And it's clear that even people who are already covered by the regulations weren't getting that protection. The other thing that springs from that case was an amendment to the right for people who are workers but not employees to walk away from dangerous situations. Up until the order, which was only put forward in 2021, if you were in the gig economy and you said, I don't want to deal with that hazardous substance, I don't want to work without PPE, you could be just told to sling your hook and you'd have no protection, no rights. You can imagine that with the growth of gig economy work, the ability to say, well, if an employee doesn't want to do it, the employee, obviously they've got rights, but you then say, right, well, we'll not keep the employees on, we'll move to gig economy workers, and they won't object because they can't object because they have no rights. And it's like something from a Steinbeck novel in the sort of United States, the prospect of getting to a situation where, because it's cheap, because it's easy, because people have no rights, you just bring in gig economy workers to do the dirty work, and they have no ability to walk away from it. And this ability to say no is sometimes the only thing that people have to protect themselves. The ability to say, I don't want to do that because that is going to harm my health. Takes a lot of bravery, because in the gig economy, you turn down a gig, you don't get another one. But having no rights, no protection is an issue. So this is quite a big thing. As Chris said, we did put in a submission there. I hope that what we said had some influence. In the bigger scale of things, I know friends in Scotland who would like to be in Europe, back in the European sort of system of law. Obviously, we're not directly in the European system of law. However, many of our employers, many of the organisations that Occupational Hygiene work with are multinational. They work in Europe. So changes in European standards have an indirect impact on the standards that we're likely to work to. So there's some big changes on the horizon, which you're probably already aware of. They won't automatically become changes in this country's law. HSE will continue to look at what's going on, and if you want to find out how changes, for example, in OELs, WELs are going to be handled by HSE, they were very kind enough to turn up and do a webinar for us, and we sort of did a little bit of additional work about what that means for us. But on the 14th of February, so in this month, the European Parliament are likely to approve some significant changes to what was the Carcinogen and Mutagen Directive. The number one thing is that it's not just the Carcinogen Mutagens Directive, it will be reprotoxic substances directive as well. So reprotoxins will be going into that directive. And alongside that will be some new binding occupational exposure limits, particularly for benzene going down, which will have an impact on a lot of undertakings in Scotland, not least because of the link with the petrochemical industry. So a lot of companies will be dealing with lower OELs coming from Europe, as well as new values for acrylonitrile and nickel, which may have a smaller impact on us, but are nonetheless things that are going to be sort of coming our way. And I think we're going to have to keep an eye on how this carcinogens, mutagens, and reprotoxic substances directive evolves, because I still think that we're going to have an influencing factor from there. Another area which is of great interest to us is where the European Parliament have gone with the with protection for workers on asbestos. The nerds amongst us will know that the European Parliament initiated the regulations on asbestos. It wasn't actually the Commission It was the democratically elected people from the member states who said we need to have protection for workers from asbestos. So it's on their own initiative, and they're carrying on that trade. So ECHA, who you'll know as the European Chemicals Agency, put out a consultation last year, amongst other things, recommending that the occupational exposure limit for asbestos was dropped significantly. BOHS supported the Faculty of Asbestos Assessment and Management to do a thorough international review of the science on that, and we produced an extensive piece of work. And our recommendations were that actually, from a practical point of view and a UK perspective in terms of UK practice, dropping the OELs was not necessarily the best thing to achieve worker health protection, for a variety of reasons that you can read in the report. It might seem counterintuitive to those of you who are not involved in asbestos, but those involved in asbestos will probably understand why. Interestingly, in response to that, the European Commission, so that's the sort of bureaucracy, accepted the notion that there should not be a reduction in the occupational exposure limit for asbestos, and recommended to the Parliament that they didn't do that reduction. And unusually, the Parliament ignored them. So European Parliament in October of last year decided nonetheless, despite the recommendations of the Commission, to go for a lower OEL. Now, that's not going to directly affect us. Very marginal sort of impact potentially on Northern Ireland, nothing on Scotland particularly. But if you want to read what it looks like to see a political body start to wake up to the dangers of poor occupational hygiene, do have a read of the European Parliament's resolution. There are lots of whereases and all of that kind of thing, so it's formalised language. But the really interesting things in there are, as well as saying that there needs to be a systematic approach to removal, the notion of having standardized high quality training in asbestos work, but more importantly, the recognition that people with long latency illnesses need to have a voice. And they're making a recommendation in Europe that there is an ombudsperson set up to enable people with long latency occupational illnesses to have control and leverage over national political institutions, over bureaucracies, to help them through the challenges that are there. Just note that many of you will have noticed that the Work and Pensions Committee took evidence this week on the effectiveness of the UK asbestos regulations. We, as BOHS, submitted a detailed piece of work in terms of written evidence, and we were invited to give oral evidence, which we did, and it was very interesting to see the Minister and the Chief Executive of HSE and the Chief Scientific Officer of HSE being asked some of the questions that we had raised. And no, there is an opportunity for the Work and Pensions Committee to start thinking in the same way as the European Parliament, that occupational exposures need proper support. They need more statutory support. There needs to be more of a plan, not just for asbestos, but everywhere else. And so part of how we influence everyone, not just the people we sort of see if we're occupational hygiene consultants, not just the big organisations who might employ us, is through this process of advocacy and persuasion. And we are, through the European platform on occupational hygiene that's just been set up, we're going to try and engage directly with the European Parliament and try and continue the process of supporting them with the idea of protecting everyone from long latency illnesses and occupational exposure. So a lot of legalism. I hope it's of interest, but going down to sort of something very close to my heart. Civil law in Scotland, as I say, is absolutely fantastic. I'm a great believer in the importance of civil law. A lot of the achievements of the environmental lobby have not been because of regulators. It has been because people use the courts to stand up for their rights. And I would say to anyone who had the choice, go to Scotland, because they've got fantastic lawyers, and actually their system is better suited for litigating for people's rights in terms of occupational illness. You get higher levels of compensation from Scottish courts in terms of occupational exposures. The attempts to suggest that if it's an English firm who operates in Scotland who exposes a Scottish worker, then that should be litigated in England. That's just been bounced out by the Scottish courts. The bureaucracy of what you've got to put together to go to court is considerably less. The pre-action protocols are easier. And this might seem sort of strange, but it's a slower process to get into court, which helps very often the pursuer to get their act together. And very importantly, the old rules that used to mean that the loser in a piece of litigation paid in employment and employer cases, that's been abandoned. So you go to court, you don't necessarily wager that if you lose, you not only lose the case, you lose all your costs. And that is really, really important. And they've just streamlined and made it easier for groups of workers to collectively claim against an employer. Now, this might not be directly influencing occupational hygienists, but what will happen, what will start happening, is that people will start going to court. And occupational hygienists have a really good hit rate of giving evidence, and the evidence being supported by courts. So, there's a whole line of opportunity for occupational hygienists to be providing more expert evidence to courts to help claimants to get what they should get, and to encourage people to see the financial costs of non-compliance. Some great Scottish cases which are maybe of interest and just may be helpful to occupational hygienists when sort of thinking about how you talk to clients, especially clients who might have agency workers, gig workers, etc., on the peripheries, etc. So these are interesting. They're COVID cases. So Montanaro is an Italian who was working in Scotland. COVID broke out. They were off in Italy, and they said, "I don't want to come back because if I come back from where I am, I'm gonna get COVID because my employer is not making enough, doing enough in terms of safety." He was immediately dismissed, despite him having said, "I'll work remotely or give me some PPE or something like that, but I don't want to be working in a dangerous environment." And the Scottish court said he was unfairly dismissed. He was automatically unfairly dismissed under Section 100. That his refusal to work and the employer's refusal to take appropriate steps meant that he was automatically entitled to unfair dismissal claim. And that's quite a big award. That's sort of big numbers, etc. You can contrast that with another case where the person refused to work but didn't actually sort of say, well, okay, can I have some PPE? Can I work at home, etc. They just sort of said, I don't want to get COVID. I'm not turning up for work. It might be COVID. It might be any other exposure, but the right not to work and not to subject yourself to illness as a result of exposure is a really important one. And the penalty of automatic unfair dismissal is really, really important, largely because any employer will talk to their HR department if they got one. The HR department say, we're going to lose if we take this on, and you're going to lose money now. So it's going to cost you your balance sheet now. And so that's really, really quite important. And the scale of money that people are going to end up paying is often significantly more than the likely fine that you're going to get from HSE, unless there's a lot going on there. So another example is Gibson, and Gibson refused to turn up to work because of the lack of appropriate PPE. It's another COVID case, but it's a PPE case. Again, he was dismissed, and his concern was not about his own safety, but the potential safety of a vulnerable dependent. And again, it was deemed to be automatic unfair dismissal, and he won the case. By contrast, and Diamanatis is a really interesting case. This is a person who was working for a company. The company required him to wear a face mask. He was a delivery driver, and their clients all required him to wear a face mask, not for his own protection, but for the protection of other workers. And he refused to do so. And the court, very interestingly, said, well, in terms of the protection of other workers, and also in terms of the inconvenience, because the supplier wasn't able to go on site when he was driving, that was enough to justify a dismissal. So it's an interesting one, because it sort of reinforces in Scotland a direction which is not being followed in England, which is the obligation of the individual to protect other members of the workforce, and the power of the employer to ensure that people protect others in their behaviour and their actions. So a load of little legalese type of things, hopefully of some interest, hopefully highlighting a couple of things. One, BOHS as an advocate of systematic change, legislative change, but also the power of Scottish law to really promote occupational hygiene. And please do keep an eye on what happens in the Scottish courts. They are useful to sort of guide employers, even if they're saying, well, are we compliant with a UK well? Well, wells aren't everything, but you can sort of point out you might not be, there might not be a well there, or we might be within the well limits, etc. But do you really want to have a lawsuit that's going to cost you, £150,000 because of automatic dismissal, because someone walks off because you're not doing the right thing and they've got a genuine concern? So with that, I will sort of say, I will see whether there are any questions.
Many thanks for that, Kevin. It was definitely food for thought, I think, for everybody. Have we got any questions?
There's nothing like a good dose of law to completely clear your brains.
Just pull up the chat box, see if we've got anything there. Nope. Any questions for Kevin? Haven't got any hands up yet. There's nothing in the chat box. Come on, don't be shy.
Well, there's a lot there.
Let's take in.
That's quite an achievement, Kevin, to get a bunch of hygienists to stay quiet. It takes a lot to do that.
Always a desirable outcome for a lawyer is to not have any further questions. But we'll certainly, if it's of interest, we'll share all of this information so that you can read and digest at your leisure. There's a lot that is going on around occupational hygiene that will impact us.
Oh, I've got a hand up there. I can just see now. Graham, have you got a question for Kevin?
Yeah, just a quick one, Kevin. Is the position in Scotland any different to England in terms of employers being able to insist on their workers being vaccinated?
That's a really, really interesting question. In effect, the answer is no. There's slight contractual difficulties, differences, etc. The case law that I've just talked about is indicating that Scottish courts are probably going to be more sympathetic to an employer mandating vaccination in the interest of protecting other employers. So that last case would indicate it. There's nothing in the substantive regulations to suggest that. There is statutory guidance, which is probably a little bit more forthright.
Thanks, Kevin.
That was like a lawyer's answer, yes or yes and no. I think the answer is if you go to court to try and fight it, you're probably going to lose. You've got a higher likelihood of losing in Scotland than you have in England.
Any other questions? I'd like to bring Chris back in then, and if you've got any questions for Chris or Kevin. Quiet. Oh. So I've just got a question in. One issue we used to see years ago, this is for Kevin, was that many employees and gig employees who are collectively non-unionised found it difficult to access the law. How has that changed in recent years, if at all?
Okay, so it hasn't changed hugely. For it's still a problem. The Independent Workers Union, which is a relatively new union, is working very hard to promote understanding the law. And actually, one of the things that we're doing for them is doing some basic guidance, not on occupational hygiene, but basically on the really, really basic rights that allow you to access those things. There are more legal practices who are willing to sort of engage with this, and the big thing about the pursuer not having to pay legal costs, that's a major thing to enable gig employees in Scotland to be able to litigate. Up until then, if you went to court, nobody really could bankroll you, because if you've got a big employer, they could just sort of wipe you out and wipe out a law firm that if they wanted to do it pro bono. So the group claim ability, that's a really novel thing. Many of you will have seen, American lawsuit sort of movies where sort of small law firms go around and recruit people for group claims, etc. We've not had that ability in this country very easily, but now it is possible for a bunch of non-unionised people in one area who are suffering from illness to actually get together to find a sort of a not-for-profit lawyer and to go after people in the court. But the basic thing is being able to understand the law. And these changes, what we have to do is make sure that gig employees know that they have these rights. Whether it's part of what BOHS does, that's a really interesting question. It would be a new and novel departure for BOHS, but working with our Independent Workers Union, it's easy enough for me to sort of get really basic legal advice through to them for them to get to other gig workers. So thanks, Alex.
Any other questions? Nope. Well, in that case, then I think we should follow Mary's comment and give Chris and Kevin a big round of applause. So thank you to both of you for a really good presentation and for a really interesting afternoon. I think we've all learnt a lot today, so thank you very much.